If you want to know a person's true character, observe how they treat those who don't matter. I think this is an important quote because it really relates to Emma and how the true character of the upper class shows based on how they treat the poor. So, background of Emma. Jane Austen's novels have been around for hundreds of years because of their ageless themes in each novel. In her latest novel, Emma, one of Austen's themes was social status. Emma was first published in 1816 and later became a movie in 1996 directed by Harvey Weinstein. So, what are the social classes in Regency England? There's the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. So the upper class consisted of the royalty and aristocracy. Basically, they kept to themselves and were born into the money and titles that they got. So basically, they didn't have to work for anything. The middle class were considered the professionals, and they made money in trade. So they were the factory owners, bankers, lawyers, etc. And Jane Austen's father was actually a clergyman. So he was the middle class, which could affect how she wrote about the social classes. And then there's the lower class, and that's actually divided into two classes, the working class and the poor. So the working class were working in factories and mines, basically the jobs that no one really wanted to do. So the thesis is social class in Regency England had a negative effect on the lower class citizens' lives, resulting in poor housing conditions, restrictions on who they could marry, and negatively perceived the image based on their wealth. So first point would be the poor housing conditions. In the movie, Emma Woodhouse's house had vibrant colors, plenty of food, parties and entertainment such as pianos, dancing, and singing. And then in the poor houses, there were dull colors, cheap food like potatoes and bread, and there were small rooms. So the real world evidence, the rich owned great mansions and country houses. They filled their time with opera, theater, and dinner parties. While the poor, on the other hand, usually resided in houses with 2 or 3 rooms, and the poorest would only have a 1-room house that they all crammed into. So there were also negative attitudes towards the poor. For one instance, in the movie Emma's attitude towards Miss Bates was very negative. She would avoid Miss Bates in the streets and didn't really seem to care what Miss Bates had to say. When they were playing a game about how many dull things they could say, Emma made a rude comment and said that Miss Bates would basically have too much dull things to say because she was poor. She said, "There may be a difficulty, but you'll be limited as to number, only 3. So in the real world, these people were truly at the bottom of society and were treated that way. The lower class generally dealt with other middle class people and did not associate with the upper class unless it had something to do with business. So it basically just shows that the society was super segregated, and if you were in one class, you just stuck to that class. Alright, so another negative thing about being a lower class citizen was the restrictions on marriage. There were 3 examples I found from the movie, and that was Mr. Knightley's comments on Harriet Smith, Mr. Elton not considering Harriet Smith, and Emma telling Harriet she couldn't be with Mr. Knightley. So the first one, Mr. Knightley's thoughts on Harriet Smith rejecting Mr. Martin. He did not agree with that, and he thought that she could do no better. Mr. Knightley said, "I agree, he is not her equal. He is her superior in sense and situation. What are Harriet Smith's claims of birth or education that make her higher than Robert Martin? She is the natural daughter of nobody knows whom. The advantage of the match was entirely on her side." So, in the real world evidence, parents use their children, both daughters and sons, in arranged marriages as assets to their efforts to gain and maintain wealth, connections, and power. So basically, marriage was not something you did for love. It was strictly like a business deal. All right, so the next one is Mr. Elton and Harriet Smith. Mr. Elton didn't even consider Harriet Smith just because of her social class. He was talking to Emma and was so surprised that she would even think that he would go for her. He said, "Miss Smith, what kind of message would I want to send to her? I never cared whether Miss Smith were dead or alive, except that she was your friend. She is a good sort of girl, and I'm sure there are men who would not object to. Everybody has their level." Okay, so educational and employment opportunities for women were extremely limited. Marriage was almost a necessity. So marriage was very important for the women, and they did not have the option to be choosy like Mr. Elton did. The third example is Emma's reaction to Harriet liking Mr. Knightley. So when she found this out, she said, "Good God, this is a horrible mistake. Harriet, have you any idea of Mr. Knightley returning your affection? Harriet, I can only venture to declare that Mr. Knightley was the last man on earth who would intentionally give any woman the idea of his feeling more for her than he really does." So she basically talked her out of liking Mr. Knightley just because of the social class or social status. In the real world evidence, although well-to-do men kept lower class mistresses without censure, they were faced with criticism and were even shunned if they married beneath them. So if they married beneath their social status. All right, so someone might say that not all of the upper class were mean to the lower class, and Mr. Knightley was an exception because he was kind to Miss Bates. After Emma said that to Miss Bates about her being so dull, Mr. Knightley defended her, saying, "How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates? How could you be so insolent to a woman of her age and situation?" Now, although he was kind to her, evidence shows that majority of the upper class were mean to the lower class. There was little sympathy, and the upper class rarely made any meaningful attempts to improve the lives of the lower class. So in conclusion, social class played a key role in the movie and novel Emma, and it had negative effects on the lower classes' lives, such as living conditions, who they could marry, and how other people treated them. Here are my works cited, and if you have any questions, you can comment below. Thank you.